My name is Katherine Stein, and I'm presenting on the Dickens and Childhood panel. Charles Dickens's A Child's History of England skirts the line between the historical and the fantastical, the socially liberal and the conservatively jingoistic, the fairy tale didactic and the sensational, and the ironic and sincere. It is, in short, a book of contradictions, and one that has long been lambasted by critics since its serial publication from 1851 to 53, where it has since been unanimously dismissed as a failed piece of history and as a failed piece of fiction. A Child's History surveys a history of England in 37 chapters from the time of the Romans to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, a quite ambitious project that, according to Forrester, he dictated from week to week across its roughly 3 years of composition. There is, of course, no denying A Child's History's clear historical limitations, nor are there much grounds to defend it in terms of its relative literary quality. However, it is important to remember that Dickens never set out to write a literary masterpiece, nor did he set out to write a book that served as unimpeachable historical record. While many of Dickens's original projects have been obscured, excised, or forgotten, returning to the premise of A Child's History as Dickens saw it recenters the text and helps preserve its value as an object worthy of study in its own right. Such work indicates a larger historical and literary vision that is often overlooked in what limited scholarship exists. Recovered in this new light, A Child's History becomes a compelling composite of Dickens's vision of history, of education, and of nationhood. A closer examination of the text reveals that A Child's History also does some more complicated historiographical work that ultimately serves to question the tenability of any real kind of historical objectivity at all. Through A Child's History, Dickens cultivates a critical readership and prompts his young readers to think actively about the narratives they consume, all the while seeking to encourage within his readers an expansive historical imagination and a more acute sense of historical empathy that can inform the present too. To take a few excerpts as a representative sample of the larger history, Dickens employs an energetic, explanatory tone that vacillates between a rollicking and sometimes sensational tone of historical irreverence and a style that can at times verge on a sort of patriotic Christian didacticism. In the dedication to the first edition volume of A Child's History, published in December of 1851, Dickens dedicated the book to my own dear children, whom I hope it may help by and by to read with interest larger and better books on the same subject. This is an essential, if uncharacteristically concise, qualification of A Child's History's project. As an indication of how frequently this book is considered outside its intended context, it's notable that in the more than 20 editions of the book that I have examined, only 3 retain this original dedication. This is a quite critical point of erasure, as this dedication communicates one of the essential conditions of Dickens's history, as it explicates that Dickens did not offer up this little history to the public as a substitute for concerted historical study, but rather as a supplement. From the sensationalized landscape of A Child's History, Dickens sought to inspire in his readers a true interest in historical narrative in the hopes that children might skip altogether the onslaught of catechisms and didacticisms that were to be found elsewhere, and from his history, move directly into the realm of what Jane Austen in Northanger Abbey dubs real serious history. Here, of course, we might think of Hard Times, which was written hard on the heels of A Child's History of England. As you can see here, the final installment of A Child's History ran in December of 1853, and the first number of Hard Times debuted in April of 1854. If one were to be presented with Dickens's about 400-page long history, one might imagine it to be just as inflexible, dry, and dictatorial as the voice of Thomas Gradgrind. And indeed, Dickens's history does admittedly contain a reasonable number of facts, and we do know that it was, at least for a time, taught in British classrooms. The critical difference, of course, is in how these facts of history are presented and to what end. While Thomas Gradgrind is introduced as a kind of cannon loaded to the muzzle with facts, prepared to blow students clean out of the regions of childhood at one discharge, Dickens's history, far from blowing children out of the regions of childhood, seeks, across the 1,200 plus years of history it surveys, to provide more imaginative artillery for the children reading it. While Gradgrind's facts are presented because they are facts, after all, facts alone are wanted in life, Dickens's history was written in the hopes that his account might inspire a spirit of reform-mindedness that dispenses of outdated conservative notions and initiates change. Put a different way, Dickens sets out to write a history that emphasized to his young readers the biases, blind spots, and injustices of English history. Of course, this was implemented imperfectly. The history itself is unsurprisingly riddled with its own share of national, imperial, racial, and religious prejudice. As G.K. Chesterton remarked, the history tells us nothing about the periods it talks about, but it tells us a great deal about the period in which it was written. While the Gradgrind school champions nothing but facts, when one opens Dickens's history, it is best to lay aside the impulse to parse the book's precise level of factual historicity. Dickens began work on a child's history of England as early as 1843, and while no extant manuscript scraps exist from this period, he articulates in his letters a clear historical vision for his project that offers a useful framework for encountering the text in its final form today. In May of 1843, Dickens wrote this letter to Douglas Jerrold, where we see that Dickens was seeking to expand his young reader's historical vision. Having identified the deeply embedded conservative biases that threaded so pervasively through many of the educational tracts and treatises of the period, Dickens sought, through a child's history, to offer an alternative. Anticipating the ease with which even his own children might fall prey to such malignantly indoctrinatory strains, Dickens sought to quash the transmission of such conservative doctrines by penning a history of his own that works to counteract and rebut any conservative or high church notions. In this letter to Jerrold, it is notable that he speaks of the project in terms of utility when he discusses the possibility of Jerrold's boys, note the gender-specific term here, Jerrold also had 2 daughters, profiting by the professedly anti-indoctrinatory projects of Dickens's history. Already, this exposes some of the pedagogical contradictions embedded in the history's very premise. 9 months later, Dickens wrote this letter to Miss Burdett Coutts. As we see here, from almost the very beginning, a child's history is articulated explicitly as an actively empathetic project, one that aims to develop in its young readers tender-hearted notions of war and murder that may guard against fixed affections for the wrong heroes. Embedded here is an implicit recognition of the imaginative investment that is, at least to a certain extent, inevitable within the engaging and pseudo-novelistic mode of historical storytelling that a child's history represents. It is also important to observe that Dickens aims at a level of historical even-handedness that was rare for the histories of the period. It was important to him that both the bright side and the rusty side of glory's sword must be visible. For Dickens, a child's history was intended as a corrective that was designed to operate against the pervasive ideologies and catechistic didacticisms that were common to the educational tracts of the period. While there are times that Dickens's history verges into a participation in, rather than a complete denunciation of, these pedagogical modes that he had originally set out to critique, the book still stands as a more liberal deviation from the norm. Ultimately, however, the most important work being done in a child's history has more to do with how Dickens encourages his young audiences to read his book. Across the history, Dickens explicitly and repeatedly de-emphasizes himself as an authoritative historical source. The narrator of a child's history interjects loudly and frequently in a way that not only reminds readers of his presence, but that also serves to subvert the text's historical authority overall. Through the narrator, Dickens intersperses a steady stream of narrative equivocations that refuse to offer any consistent stance of historical objectivity, and instead emphasizes the subjectivity of historical narrative in a way that asks readers to think critically and to draw their own conclusions independently of the overbearing influence of the narrator, or, for that matter, the author. With the narrator clearly established as a subjective interpreter of history, historical motives are not asserted as historical fact, but rather as freewheeling and inherently subjective speculation. It is not fact, but opinion that characterizes historical figures' intentions. In the second chapter, for example, the narrator dispenses with the possibility of attaining any kind of objective knowledge of historical intention when he remarks frankly about what his opinion is. There are other times in the history when Dickens refuses to commit to any kind of historical competence at all. In this moment, in chapter 4, Dickens's equivocation is such that it ostensibly puts into question the viability of full historical certainty of any kind. You may be pretty sure that it had been weakened under Dunstan's direction. In the same chapter, Dickens grapples directly with the inevitability of historical uncertainty when he narrates pieces of history like Ironside's death. Some think that Ironside was killed and killed by Canute's orders, but no one knows. Significantly, As Dickens worked to collect the serialized numbers into a bound edition, you'll see that Dickens's revisions serve to structurally emphasize this admission of the impossibility of complete historical knowledge. It is this stark admittance that no one knows that concludes the fourth chapter of the history and all bound editions of the book. There are other times in the text when Dickens's narrator not only entertains the possibility of other interpretations, but baldly disagrees with them in a way that emphasizes the subjectivity of history even more dramatically. As Dickens writes in the fourth chapter, some people are included to think this nonsense a part of Dunstan's madness, but I think not. I observe that it induced the ignorant people to consider him a holy man, and that it made him very powerful, which was exactly what he always wanted. Here, Dickens even goes so far as to use the purportedly objective, pseudo-scientific language of observation, which ostensibly moves a step further to imply that even the narrative realm of quantitative and observable science must be beheld with a similarly critical eye. Here, Dickens juxtaposes the subjective interjection of the narrator, I think, I observe, with the seemingly objective act of observation in a way that reminds readers that even observable evidence has an agenda and narrative of its own that must be considered critically. The Dickens narrator also does not hesitate to promote his own utterly subjective agenda in the course of describing more trivial matters. In the longer run, the effect of such micro-insertions of subjectivity contribute to the broader sense of the narrator's, thus history's, incapacity for full and complete objectivity. At different points in the story, too, Dickens confides in his readers that I have no doubt about one historical phenomenon, or that I dare say something about another, which in turn reminds the readers of all the moments where there is some doubt, or other moments wherein he does not dare to put forth some historical interpretation or another. Elsewhere, Dickens indulges in other moments of historical speculation that, in their resistance to any conclusive stance at all, allows room for, and in fact encourages, other historical interpretations, an effect that requests, if not requires, the active and critical participation of the reader. In many of these moments, not only is Dickens actively reinforcing and encouraging this method of critical reading, but many of these moments are also ones that model acts of historical empathy and imagination, where readers are asked to imagine for themselves what it would be like to live in these times of old. At the close of chapter 5, for example, Dickens concludes an installment with a montage of moments that encourage readers to envision themselves within the historical past, and in turn, to develop through such imaginings a more empathetic regard for those otherwise distant and inaccessible historical figures. In other words, Dickens enacts here a sympathetic engagement with history that is orchestrated through imaginative means. In this passage, the narrator models this process first. I fancy I see them all on the seashore together, the king's chair sinking in the sand, the king in a mighty good humor with his own wisdom, and the courtiers pretending to be quite stunned by it. Such a careful infusion of imagery delivers a sense of realism, and in so doing, Dickens seeks to achieve for his readers an experiential encounter with this historical scene that renders otherwise distant historical figures to be accessible, familiar, and comprehensible, or at least more comprehensible than they might otherwise be. This is repeated a paragraph later, where Dickens implicitly invites the readers to enact such an imaginative envisioning for themselves. This mode of imaginative speculation places the reader squarely in the mind of Canute, and what inevitably becomes an exercise in pseudo-historical narrative prediction, speculation, imagination, and, above all, empathy. Thus, in A Child's History of England, Dickens not only develops a critical readership, but he develops an imaginative readership. Across the book, Dickens establishes historical imagination as an essential component of historical understanding, and it is through these imaginative projects that readers are led to a mode of historical empathy. While the book contains its fair share of didacticisms and is indeed infused with contradictions, Dickens's narrative style throughout requests his young readers to develop and take ownership of original readings of their own, interpretations that are wholly theirs and not bluntly absorbed via catechistic recitation. In this book for children, reading ostensibly becomes an act of empowerment, and Dickens makes an argument for the importance of creative, critical, and imaginative engagement with history specifically, and with narratives more broadly. If Dickens was for the most part successful in his original aim to wring the proverbial parrot's necks in his very cradle by guarding against horrible conservative notions, the historiographical projects of A Child's History ultimately reached to extend even further through the loud voice of the book's narrator. While I am in danger of overextending the metaphor here, in A Child's History, What Dickens ultimately offered his young readers was the means to brandish the parrots away from the cradle altogether. In the development of an independently thinking and ideally reform-minded readership, Dickens offered his child readers a lesson in critical reading that had and has the power to reach far beyond the classroom. Thank you.